Hello from Blue Willow Bookshop in Houston, Texas. My name is Kathy Berner, and I am the event coordinator here at the shop. We are so excited to host this virtual event celebrating Dolls of Our Lives, Why We Can't Quit American Girl. Authors Mary Mahoney and Allison Horrocks will appear in conversation with Margaret Lyons from the New York Times. Blue Willow's connection with American Girl goes back decades. Valerie Kaler, who owns the shop, ran an American Girl club that met monthly for more than 10 years. And through a series of coincidences, she now owns every single historical doll, and they are now all restored and pristine in their boxes in her upstairs closet, waiting to be passed on. My own daughter, who's now 25, had a Samantha doll who has a beautiful bob, and a Just Like You doll who is wearing a bell costume. And one of our dear author friends, Varsha Bajaj, who is local to Houston, has written some of the most recent American Girl books featuring Kavi Sharma, American Girl of the Year 2023. Please join me in welcoming Mary, Allison, and Margaret to the screen.
Hello.
Hey, y'all.
Hi.
Thanks so much for having us.
So glad you're here. I am going to let Margaret take over the conversation, and then I will come back when it's time for Q&A. So Margaret, you just give me a verbal cue and I'll be back.
Okay.
Thanks so much.
So it is so fun to be talking to you guys again. It's been kind of a minute. I think as fans of the podcast, all of us have probably like number one question, which is like, in what ways did you coordinate the release of this with the coordinate of with the release of Britney Spears's memoir? And do you see this as sort of like an on-ramp to that, an off-ramp to that, as sort of a two-star solar system? Where does that fit together?
Well, of course it was coordinated. It is a bit of a touchy question for you to bring this up because we did want Michelle Williams to voice our audiobook, but of course she was previously committed to Britney's and we're happy for both of them. She might get a Grammy, congrats. But, it was also really important for us to release our book on the same day as Barbara Streisand's book, who you did not mention. But so the stars really aligned for us. It all really worked out.
I guess I'm going to follow it up, getting back to sort of more of like the real B word of the book, which is Barbie. So Barbie is obviously this kind of formative figure in all of doll culture, certainly. And then for American Girl dolls, starting out as the kind of like opposition in a lot of ways, as American Girl dolls are positioned as the anti-Barbie, sort of, as younger and less sexualized and all that stuff. And then purchased by Mattel. And then now Barbie also has kind of like, what does Barbie connote has also shifted over the lifetime of American Girl dolls. I'm curious how the two of you sort of see that relationship and what your own Barbie life included.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you have seen the Barbie movie, the beginning is kind of a rejection of baby dolls, right? Because Barbie is a grown woman who has a job and a lifestyle and cars and campers and all that. And Pleasant Rowland, who created American Girl, wanted her brand to be something different, kind of anti-Barbie. And we find that when we talk to people, a lot of kids of the 80s, 90s, or the past 20 years, they find that there's a lot of fun that they can have with both. Like, it's kind of hard to make your Barbie play with an American Girl doll. Like, some of the logistics can be challenging. Like, your doll won't fit in the convertible, but I think a lot of people see them as like just imaginative play, right? Like, whether you're putting a woman in the past or you're thinking about a child in the future, like Barbie and American Girl, they can have a lot of fun together.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And I don't see American Girl as being as invested in solving the masculinity crisis. Like, no one in American Girl universe is wondering if they're hashtag enough. But I think in a similar way, both are curious about inviting girls or women to be at the center of their own stories. And I think Barbie still continues to think about kind of professional, like adult life years and being the ultimate multi-hyphenate, whereas I think American Girl has done a good job of continuing Pleasant's original vision of just focusing on girlhood and not growing up too soon.
Oh, I assume lots of the people tuned in have their dolls with them. Mine are in this kind of like noble tomb in my parents' basement, but I do have my Dana's with me, which is my next
Wow.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
So she's providing a lot of support. A lot of the book is about how American Girl dolls are dolls for grown-ups in a lot of ways, right? That there's sort of our attachment to them, our fascination with them, like, doesn't really abate. It just kind of grows up along with us. But I'm curious if you guys have thought at all about, like, what would a American grown-up look like if there was a series of like historical books and dolls that were like designed for grown-up play. I mean, not in a R-rated way, but just the sort of like that kind of imagination. What do you think that would entail, or why do you think that's so alien?
That's a great question. First of all, Margaret, my parents are here, so please hold it together. I'm scared right now. As you were asking that question, I don't know why, but my head went to thinking about Lauren Goff's book Matrix, which was probably my favorite book that I read last year. And I don't know what the toy conduit to that book would be, but I think it was a really good example of imagining adult womanhood in a historical time period that both taught you a lot about the time period, but also kind of allowed you to explore or understand what it was like to be a woman in that time, and also to have a woman at the center of that story. So I would hope that if there was a modern day conduit, I don't know, maybe Allison has a better answer, but I would hope it would be something that made me feel the way that book did.
Yeah, I think a lot of adult consumers would want the same as when they wanted American Girl in the first place. We have gone back and reread, just about every historical book. And now that we're adults, we see so many layers with the adult characters. And I feel like there are so many adult characters in the book who are just crying out for their own series. So even if they stuck to the original canon, 6 books for each character, I think so many people would buy an Uncle Guard, they would buy a Tia Dolores, they would buy these kind of side characters, because I think people have had so much fun imagining a whole life for them. And it would give them, a different companion to play with their Felicity doll or something else. But I think in a lot of ways, they're just sort of fun avatars to have around your life. And these side characters that don't get, more than a few paragraphs, modern day fans have come up with entire fan fiction novels. So it would be really easy to flesh that out.
One of the themes so Pleasant Rowland talks about that the youth is frustrated by hypocrisy, and sort of frustration is a theme that kind of is baked into the stories of all the American Girl doll books. But I also sort of thought that like frustration is a theme that's sort of baked into the podcast in your book too, with the kind of like frustration with misogyny, frustration with this kind of like dismissal of girls' interests, frustration with also sort of sometimes within the constructs of the stories themselves, where it's like, it's frustrating that these things are happening. And I was wondering if you guys sort of see frustration as kind of like a contemporary feminist virtue in a lot of ways. Is there like a sort of connection between like frustration and feminism in your eyes, or is it just kind of part of the natural condition?
That's a great question. I mean, I think it's definitely a through line through all of feminism. I think the willingness to make frustration so public and to be so open about it, I think is something of our own modern era, especially with the advent of things like social media, like the willingness to perform frustration or to be transparent about it and call it out. I mean, I think there's so much, not only in feminism, but specifically like millennial feminism of, adult life and adult womanhood not being what American Girl books, for example, might have trained us to think that, like that feminism would be solved by the time that we were adults because we grew up with girl power. And it's like, wow, surprise, that didn't happen. Like there's still misogyny, there's still all these pay disparities. My favorite statistic now that I'm obsessed with is that mascots in the NBA make more than any WNBA player. And that made me want to put my fist through a wall. No shade to mascots, I respect you. But I mean, growing up reading American Girl books, you would think, oh, good, we're going to solve this. I mean, Felicity's pretty much solved it in 1770 or 1992, depending on your view. And yet here we are, and we're still asking the same questions.
And I think what these characters showed us in a really beautiful way was, they would have minor frustrations. Like to me, frustration, that can be mapped onto something like I stubbed my toe, right? Like something inconvenient in the day to day. But I think all of these characters also have problems that we can see on a longitudinal scale. Felicity is frustrated. She has to make apple butter when she doesn't want to, but she has this sort of discontent with what being a woman in, late 18th century Williamsburg might look like, whether it's a colony or it becomes a state. And like, we know the answer of what's going to happen. And I think what's great about these characters is their discontent is always paired with hope and solutions. So by the time we go through their arc, we see their ability to change and to save the day and to create solutions where I think they're unexpected. And that messaging, especially to young girls, right, it always provides a path. So we're not just left with like one or two stories, or in the case of other popular series, 500 stories of remixing the same problems. We have a very clear and linear path to go on with them, which I think is part of why they're so comforting to reread.
That sort of is like a perfect lead into my next, because like if one of the pillars of the AG stories is frustration, you guys call it a patriotic version of history in the book. And I think there's this tension between sort of like, how can you be patriotic for a country that doesn't love you back, right? Like, and so for most of certainly the historical dolls, there's this real like, well, what would loving America mean when I don't have rights, or I'm enslaved, right? Like it's like such a it's this weird tension, because then there's like the sort of wholesomeness factor and like the real like draw. And I'm curious, as both kind of like fans and then as historians, how you think about that tension, or if you see that sort of evolving as your own understanding of sort of American politics has evolved.
Yes, I mean, that's a really intense question and something that I've been thinking about the entire time we've done this show. And obviously, as an American historian, I think that the tension between the ideals in our founding documents and the lived reality of the attempt to embody those, the distance between the ideals themselves and the lived reality at different times in American history, that gap is quite large depending on who we're talking about. And being acknowledging of that fact, I think, is really important to the study of American history, but also to these stories. And I think sometimes my frustration with the books comes from a glossing over of those differences in favor of pushing out this oversimplified view of patriotism, that you can't love something without having, calling on it to change or to complicate it. And I don't think that that's a healthy vision of citizenship to teach anyone. And I think some of the best books are the ones that don't work as hard to do that and actually trust kids to sit with complicated contradictions, like the fact that we say we're founded as a country where all men are created equal, and yet we had slavery built into our founding documents as well. I think kids can sit with that and grapple with it. And I think trusting them to do that is the best way to thread that needle of wanting to teach patriotism without propaganda.
And what a gift, that patriotism looks different for different people. Like what reads as very sincere to some people falls flat for others. We're currently going back to the Julie books, and she has this very early awareness of Title IX and wants what she's entitled to, what she has the right to as a young female athlete. And so that's what patriotism looks like to her. For Addie, claiming a very important day in US history, that's patriotism for her to choose her own birthday. So I think what's special is that people get to read through the books. One of the odder moments in rereading was seeing that Josefina is very struck by the idea of the United States. She's living in what we called the not quite United States in the 1820s in the Southwest. The very idea that someone would just be intrigued by the country, I think that's a whole other model that, isn't going to be taught necessarily in a textbook.
That was, unsurprising. Like, oh, that's so thoughtful. Those are such good answers. I'm curious, as you were putting together the book, obviously, like you'd had a lot of time with the books themselves, and then in the podcast as sort of excavating them. Did writing the book sort of turn on any other lights that you hadn't expected, or introduce sort of a real phase change in any of the ways you were thinking about American Girl stuff?
I think for me, one of the biggest surprises was the Pleasant Rowland research that we did, because we hadn't really done that much of a deep dive into her past. We knew about the whole Aurora, New York Renaissance renovation project that is controversial. In her retirement, if you're unaware, she has decided to buy many buildings in Aurora, New York, where she went to college, and renovate them according to her vision of American history. But I hadn't really known much about her early professional life. So going through kind of coverage of her work as a teacher and then a local TV news anchor in San Francisco is really interesting in kind of like providing context for what she might have hoped she was doing with the brand and then kind of like what it ended up doing.
There's a lot that I think we were learning about for the first time. There's so many aspects of American Girl that once we started putting out calls, for example, like I didn't know about the Pen Pal Club, right? I didn't know a lot about the historical clubs. So everyone kind of brings to it their own experience of the kind of bits and bobs. And what we find, I think, across like both the project of the podcast and anything related to the book, people have these sort of impressions or like vague ideas of what they loved about American Girl. And the people who I think are interested in talking about these things with us, they're also willing to look at them again or differently. And so we're all kind of in this whole other thing together. American Girl had really been something just like for me and my family and one or two friends. And now looking at American Girl with basically thousands of people, it feels completely different to me.
There's a part of the book where I was like, oh my God, me, where it's like, even if you didn't exactly remember what happened in the stories, you did really remember how you felt about them and related to them. Because when I first got into the podcast and I wrote about the show, gosh, at this point, a pretty long time ago, I reread a ton of the books and was like, what? It's like, I would have described myself as someone who like loved it and knew it well and was like, oh man, I read this stuff. So that was a part of the book that just really stuck with me. I want to make sure we get in some sort of jokier stuff because I feel like I came in kind of hot with the academic questions. But before we take some audience questions, obviously Mary has the iconic Golden Girls backdrop. I was wondering if you guys see any alignment between our sort of OG4 and the Golden Girls. And I was especially thinking about it. There's like a 2010 article that Libby Hill wrote about the sort of 4 types of women in a female sitcom. And so the slattern, the simpleton, the cynic, and the center. And you can see it on Sex and the City, Designing Women, Golden Girls, and in her article, Keeping Up with the Kardashians. I was like, oh, I wonder if this applies here. Have you mapped anything of any of the dolls into any of, let's say, the Golden Girls, for example?
Wow, I love this question so much. I guess I haven't given it enough thought. That's sort of a personal feeling, but you know, I'm thinking about Molly and it's like, okay, so who would she be in the Golden Girls? Like, is she a chaos enough agent to be Sophia? I mean, Sophia is my favorite, so I feel like I want Molly to be Sophia so my favorites can be together, but I don't know if that makes sense. I mean, who's the
chronologically, she literally could be. So that's kind of an easy
I feel like if I say Kirsten's the simpleton or the Rose, like I will be booted out of our own event by Kirsten fans who are very ardent.
You are talking to one of them.
I know.
And
I was gonna say
Molly is the Rose. Are you kidding?
Margaret. Wow, that's rough. I mean, listen, I could see Molly as a Blanche too, like just being real. Like I think we could see her doing a Miss Victory kind of situation. In fact, like they did do a tap number, Rose and Blanche. They also hosted that telethon, if you recall. Allison, any other hot takes?
I mean, Felicity is a Southerner, so that gives her a connection to Blanche, but I feel like Samantha has much greater Blanche potential, right? Mm-hmm. So I feel like I could just kind of see, just because she's kind of all about excess, which I think is an important characteristic. In terms of Dorothy, I don't know. I actually feel like Kirsten has potential to become a Dorothy. If you recall, when we read that like fairly horrific play, her obsession with her teacher, Miss Winston, growing up, becoming a teacher, she could become a lot more acerbic and witty and dry. I see potential there. I think it really depends, but I think she could be.
Wow.
Oh, but yeah.
Do you feel better, Margaret? Do you feel better about Kirsten standing?
I was like, don't turn this into a Kirsten defense panel.
Every Kirsten does this where they're like, look, I don't care. I'm like so breezy. You can say whatever you want about Kirsten. I can totally take it. And then you're like, well, I think she would be the Rose. And it's like I'm going to punch you through Zoom.
Well, I was mostly surprised, Allison, because you mentioned 2 brief little things about like being fascinated by the Amish as a child, as was I, which was why I was like, ooh. And I feel like some of that overlapped with some Kirsten stuff for me. So that kind of like the like level of technological access was in alignment. So in terms of like what fascinated me, was not, as you suggested, that I had a parent who worked at IKEA or that I was from the Midwest, but that it was also like it fit in with sort of like Little House on the Prairie, but also like Julia the Wolves and kind of like any kind of wildernessy, independent, butter churning kind of
exercise.
Yeah. The book also touches on, or not just touches on, really gets into sort of the role the catalog played. And it also made me think, like, what was the handoff between obsessed with American Girl doll catalog into Delia's catalog? You guys remember that transit? And it's like, ooh, there was definitely a time when it was both, but I feel like that kind of mail order as foundational literature, like part of it does move along that path. I'm curious if there was anything else you see as kind of part of that, like catalog era, like really aspirational, like this is our definitive texts, and it's like from a sales document.
Yes. I mean, I don't know that Delia's was as for me, like foundational to me, although one time I did order a dress sight on, like, of course, sight unseen, you're just ordering everything on faith from Delia's for a dance, and it came like the day of the dance. So had it not worked out, that would have been disastrous for me. Was it a win anyway? I don't really know, but I mean, I did wear this dress. I'm trying to think, because to me, it's like, I always thought of the American Girl catalog like people in Kirsten's time thought about the Sears catalog. Like, it's just foundational. It's where you're getting like all of your livelihood, even though that wasn't literally true. That's how it felt to me.
And I don't know that the word tween was used that much when we were in those ages, right? Like before the year 2000. I don't know that that was so important. But I think American Girl and things like Delia's and Claire's, they just kind of gave you a bridge, right? Like you weren't exactly interested in certain kinds of shopping, but you didn't want to just look at a toy catalog, right? That felt like it was for much younger people. So it kind of gave you this place to, you know, and this is what Pleasant Rollin designed, but to kind of like sit with girlhood or to sit with consumerism and to say, what are the things that only I am interested in? And I think that's what's part of what made that American Girl catalog so special. If you remember, it was huge. Like it had to be curled in the mailbox. And so short of knowing that you would get like maybe a college acceptance or something really exciting in the mail one day, like seeing this massive thing in the mailbox that came for free just for you, I think Rolland and others were just brilliant in marketing it that way as something that could be exceptionally personal, even though you knew that, you know, millions of other girls were getting it too.
So I think it's just about time to open it up to the audience Q&A. I'm going to ask Kathy to field a couple of those questions for us, por favor.
My screen was not cooperating with me. My apologies. Before I get to the questions, I do want to come back to one of the comments that y'all made when you were talking about patriotism and what kids can handle when they're reading. And just anecdotally, I'm a librarian and now I'm a bookseller and I've been doing this for 25 years, and that is spot on. A child will put something down or it will go over the head if they're not ready to deal with it. So I think you should never underestimate a tween reader. And fun fact, according to Oxford bibliographies, tween came into use in the late 1990s.
There you go.
So there you go. Once a librarian, always a librarian. All right. First question from Lillian. Now that the 20th century has been thoroughly covered by American Girl, where do you think the brand will go in terms of future characters? Will it return to previously covered eras with different perspectives, or dive back into earlier eras of American history?
That's
Gosh,
a great question.
I think, you know, compared to other periods, you are spot on in saying that they have, you know, done amazing coverage of the decades. And yet, particularly with the characters who got the Be Forever edition stories, we're thinking of Melody, Mary Ellen, you know, they're set right in the middle of the century. Even when we read Kit, there were so many times where we felt like we wanted to read about the same time period from a completely different perspective. So at the start of the century, we have Samantha and we have Rebecca. Now we have Claudie, right? We have this amazing coverage. And yet the 1970s would look so different if it wasn't from Julie's perspective, right? If we weren't in California with Julie, but we were somewhere else entirely, we would have this other way of experiencing that. I've always voted really hard to go back further. I'd like to see 17th century, which I think will almost absolutely never happen because the merchandising opportunities are spotty. But I think Claudie is a wonderful example of how they chose a story really sandwiched between eras that were already very well covered, but the way that they were able to build out her experience as a dancer in Harlem and to think about all those different other avenues she can go. She can travel to the South. I think that's a great example of where going deeper instead of trying to search too far afield, they could also do really well.
Mary, did you have any other
Yeah, I mean, I second what Allison said. I think for me, I would find it interesting if they did a witch trial era doll, because I think that would be really fun. I don't think they're going to do it. None of my wishes are going to come true. I want a Shaker doll. I want a Shaker girl who lives in a utopian community and is like questioning what it means to live in the United States. I think that would be really interesting. And, you know, I think the Kaya books were interesting because it was before the United States. And so here we have a girl who's navigating her life and her world without thinking about nationhood in the way that we might. And I think that that would be a really interesting concept to introduce to kids as well. So there's so many different possibilities. Again, I would love like a child star vis-a-vis Shirley Temple. I have a lot of ideas. I don't think any of them will be accepted. Maybe a child pageant star. You know, I haven't been approached by the brand yet, but I have a lot of concepts, so I'm ready.
Wow. The Shirley Temple. I am fully on board with that one, as well as all your other ideas. And just shouting out to you, Jordan, I think Allison and Mary have covered that for you as well. Let's move on to a question from Mark. If new parents are introducing American Girls to their kids today, do you think there's any kind of context they should focus on or prioritize that might have been missing for kids in the 90s?
So I think context is always important. I'll just share my experience of reading the books. My parents are here, as Margaret will remember from, you know, some earlier references that were controversial for me. But I cherished reading these books because I read them with my mom and my two brothers. And something that was really special about that is, you mentioned being a librarian yourself. My mom is a librarian. And after we would read the books, we would go to our public library and I would do deep dives on sort of tangential topics that came up that were really interesting to me. So for example, reading the Addie books were my favorite books. And it was my first introduction to the history of slavery. And then my mom took me to the library and I got books on slavery and we had conversations about it. And I think that the intention was always that these would be bridges or conversation starters with your parents, with loved ones in your life, adults, caregivers. And I think that is so crucial. I think what kids in the 90s didn't have as much was the internet, but I would argue what's needed now is not more internet, it's more filtering with human beings in your life who are going to make sure that you have access to truthful information that, you know, you can have conversations with in ways that you can understand. So for example, in the Felicity books, you know, she lives in a world where her parents instantly claim ownership of two people, and yet we're supposed to think she's not racist because she has a Black friend. So if I was a parent introducing my child to the Felicity books, I would use that as a jumping off point to maybe talk about how we should think about race and why having a Black friend is not a get out of jail free card for being a white person in America sitting with racism. So, I mean, that's kind of my just off the dome thoughts.
And talking to people who read these books a long time ago, you know, folks really, I think we bear this out very well, are not likely to remember a ton of specific plot points. They're not going to hold on to too many particulars. What I think people remember the most is some kind of experiential or hands-on learning that was paired with the books. And that can be as simple as like interacting with an adult or another trusted person and chatting about what you're experiencing, right? Like physically looking at books together and having that as something that you share. I also think like the way that the books look special and designed for young people to learn in a particular way. but also people who took the craft books, right? And you don't have to have the craft books. A lot of them have been digitized or they're pretty cheap online. Making something from a different period or asking yourself, how could my life be different if I didn't live now? It lets you imagine a different future because you realize things are not as fixed, right, as you might imagine. So you shouldn't take one-to-one lessons. Like Kirsten lets a raccoon live with her family. The goal is not to say like, how might I domesticate a raccoon, but rather, what would my life be like if I lived in a situation like hers, and what kind of hard choices would I be able to grapple with my friends and family and whoever else is around you. So I think that's what people really remember is the conversations and like tactile learning. Like someone mentioned to us earlier today, trying to recreate the quilt, right, from Kirsten and asking themselves, like, is this something I would enjoy? What do I like to do? You know, just as a starting off point, I think they're still pretty great for that.
Just as just a slight defense as a Kirsten.
Here we go again.
Lots of people on Instagram who've domesticated raccoons. Do I think it's for me? No. Does it appear to be enriching their lives and more importantly, the lives of those raccoons? Yes, it does.
I'm scared for you right now. I'm calling animal control in your area and just alerting them. Maybe do a wellness check-in with you. See what's going on
a lot
in
of
your house.
interesting. Lady taught him how to do prayer hands when he wants another snack. It's pretty cute.
I hope y'all have had rabies shots. That's all my concern. Here is one from Danny. You have spent time on the podcast talking about friendship and its value for women and girls throughout history, and the friendship between the two of you is one of Danny's favorite parts of the podcast. How are you able to stay such great friends while working on these many different projects together?
Well, I think it's a challenge just to maintain friendships over a long period of time as you're moving through different stages of life. So, I mean, I'll just say when we met, we were 22, 23 years old or something like that. We just started grad school. And obviously now our lives are very different in a lot of ways, but I think a through line, and now we actually like own a business together. So that's like a change. And we never anticipated that the show would blow up the way that it did, or that we'd have the opportunity to write this book. But I think generally speaking in friendship, like being intentional is really important about, how you want your relationship to evolve.
Yeah, I think the books again like have all different models for the way that you can like choose to interact with people, right? Like friendship looks very different depending on which character you're examining or which kind of conversation. And I think part of what is like different about what we've tried to do is we're not trying to one up each other in a professional conversation. It's about learning with other people, right? Like learning together, learning as part of a larger community. A lot of people who have been listening for a while, they've become friends with each other. So I think it's become a layered thing in a way that I could have never anticipated when I was younger or even 5 years ago, because our world has been forced to interconnect in a way that's very different, right? So having a friendship over Discord or having, different kinds of relationships, there's different ways that you can stay close now that I think were unfathomable even 5 years ago.
Here is Katie piggybacking on Danny's question. Katie is curious about your writing process together. What is that like? How do you get started? Does one person handle the sentence level writing and someone else handles the outline? She says, please discuss.
So we had a lot of different kind of processes as we went along. We should say that when we started, we sold the book before the pandemic. So we were going to go on more trips. It was going to be kind of a slightly different book. But I think the first chapter we did kind of together in a Google Doc. We were on Zoom and we were like talking through we had written our own stories and kind of like talking through how we wanted that chapter to look. For other chapters, we split things up. So, I did a lot of chapter 2, Allison did a lot of chapter 5. And, for the others, we kind of just collaborated together. It's a book built in Google Drive for sure. We're not sponsored, but, that kind of collaboration is helpful. And then we had a really great editor who gave us great feedback and helped us kind of shape the view of the vision of the book and what we should expand on and that kind of thing.
I think what was different writing for this audience versus other things, saying things out loud on a voice memo and then hearing it back and seeing how that would kind of play, right? So even portions of chapter 2, we recorded ourselves thinking about what we'd experienced, and then that kind of gets translated into writing for print. That's something that I think is like easier to do than it used to be, where you can try to capture something of a voice in a way that is different than if you were just writing for the web or writing for, a journal or something like that.
Here is one from Megan. What did American Girl have that Dear America didn't? I know obviously the answer is dolls, but what else do you think might have contributed to that?
Wow. Is Dear America the Kirsten of other girls directed series?
No.
Like, I'm feeling some defensiveness, Megan. I just want to say that I'm a huge fan of Dear America too. And I feel like they are like in the same universe together in my mind. I think what American Girl had that was really important to Pleasant Rowland is that they had not only just the dolls, but kind of the material culture of that character's world. And when she went to Colonial Williamsburg and was inspired to create American Girl, something that she took from that trip was that Williamsburg, if you've never been there, has people who are interpreting the past by like embodying whole characters. And they use individual people's stories plus the kind of objects and things from their lives to really teach you about a whole other time in American history. So American Girl was conceived with those two things together, that there would always be stories and then individual dolls with their own accessories, and playing with both of those things would teach you about American history. So I think Dear America is just kind of coming from a different conceptual plane. I will also say they're willing to take on wilder storylines in some ways in American Girl. If you've not read the Titanic book, put your life on hold, go read the Dear America Titanic book, and I'll leave it there. They also have tackled Salem witch trials, I'll just say that, and that was also quite a ride.
Now I'm also just picturing if Pleasant Rowland had been inspired by the Salem Witch Museum rather than Colonial Williamsburg.
That's what I'm saying.
I mean, like the animatronic guy who screams out for more weight.
Oh my God, I love that museum.
Doesn't have the same
the gravitas.
A little different.
I mean,
but obviously it stuck with me from that 8th grade field trip. So
it did. It reached you, and look where it got you. I mean, you're here with us talking about dolls. It all worked out.
Here's a question from Erica. Can y'all talk about the difference between writing and thinking about the world as a historian and reading or writing historical fiction? Does your professional brain ever fight with your reader brain?
I will say no, because, and this actually gets personal for me, because I think there's a snobbishness in academic history against fiction that tackles history, which I think has really valuable scholarly value. I think Hilary Mantel was an amazing historian. And the fact that anyone would denigrate her writing because she was writing fiction is insane to me. What she could do that a lot of academic historians can't do is write things that were readable and that people would seek out. And those would often form the pathways to classrooms when people got to college to study history. And I know this because I became a historian because of American Girl. And I remember our podcast in part comes from my frustration at being in grad school and naming American Girl as my inspiration for being a historian, and being made fun of because I didn't list some, monograph. And even though I love academic history, I had to be real. Popular history, which is often based in fiction, is what a lot of people's first touch point is with history. And I think, you can watch something and it can kind of grind your gears if it's your area and you're bothered by an anachronistic detail. But for me, it's about the storytelling and getting at the larger truth of that moment. So if something is able to do that, then I think it's great.
Allison, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'll be honest. I'll just say I'm not super sure as an adult that I always love historical fiction. I feel like I have such an affinity for the historical fiction I read as a kid. For me, contemporary fiction is actually where I'm able to work out some of my ideas and like challenges with the modern world. And so I really like find a lot of solace and comfort in that. And it's not that I, don't see the value in all kinds of historical fiction. It's not even that the settings really trip me up. I find that my brain just has finite space. And so if I need to really think about a time period, I would rather read a novel about anything where I can just flush the contemporary stuff out and then read a straight monograph on the topic. For some reason, that pairing, it's like history and fiction, but historical fiction confuses me because then I'm not sure where I got a fact. So there's a lot of historical fiction from my childhood where I can very vividly say, okay, no, that's Felicity. That didn't actually happen in colonial Williamsburg. But if I read very good historical fiction, I might get confused in a way that's different. So that's a compliment in a weird way.
It is, but it's also fast. It's always interesting to see and learn how someone else processes things and experiences and what their preference is on genre. Here's one from Maura. For both of you, which doll story do you view the most differently now as an adult rereader versus as a child reader? She adds, as a reformed Felicity, I can't help but notice Mary shall take her tea this evening.
Uh-oh. I hate to come out against the American Revolution subtly during this event. Maura, I wish you hadn't noticed that. Sorry. If anything, it's more, this is my Mary Tyler Moore cosplay. You can't see, but it has an M on it. So that's kind of more what this is about for me. But I'll say I didn't read these books as a child because it was just when I aged out of it. But I know I would have read these books really differently as a child. And those are the Josefina books. And that's because the American Girl books largely stay away from religion, which I think is for the best. But Josefina has such Catholic guilt and such, frankly, really unhealthy relationships with shame, particularly around how she's processing the grief around her mother's death, that I know as a child, I would have read that very differently and very sincerely. And I think I wouldn't have bumped against it and had an internal voice say, you know, if you accidentally break a vase, you should not run screaming out of your aunt's house yelling shame, 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 and climb a tree as Josefina does. Like, maybe that's not a healthy response to that moment. So I think in my mind anyway, that's the biggest difference I kind of felt as an adult versus child reader of these books.
Definitely Samantha for me. I was so mean about Samantha like 5+ years ago. I just always felt like I didn't connect with her character at all. And now I absolutely adore those books. I love the adult characters. I find like a lot of aspects of her story sort of comforting. And the fact that you could actually buy the real house that her home is modeled on, like that's even, kind of more thrilling. But I would say definitely Samantha, like the labor history piece is something that I had totally forgotten about. I had really, relied on assumptions. I know the book that I was objectively the wrongest about is Meet Kirsten because I did not remember her friend dying, which is a pretty big omission, but I think also reflective of the fact that she does move on and make a new friend pretty quickly. So that's the one objectively I was the most wrong, but Samantha, I think on a philosophical level, I really got her wrong too.
Here's one from Sarah. If you had to choose an American Girl book format to tell a favorite life story, would you meet, learn a lesson, have a surprise, celebrate your birthday, save the day, or change?
Sarah, we have like great news for you. That's literally the format of our book. So we did not choose, I feel like is the cheating answer to that question.
Yes, you will get to read our meet story and our change story in particular. So buckle up. I mean, there's a lot of like personal histories in there. I want to be as salacious as possible in teasing what may or may not be revealed in our personal stories.
I don't think I'm capable of a saves the day, but I think I would love to reflect on a super important birthday. I think that would be a lot of fun.
I would like to write one about my grandmother and have it be literally any of these, but like Fluffy is a saves the day book, I think would be really great. I don't know if anyone would want to read it but me, but I would love that.
That is awesome. Okay, here's one from Ayana. Do you think there is a gap in the market for what American Girl provided in the 90s? As in a variety of ways to explore history with young girls through novels, the material culture, clothing, or has the internet made such a concept obsolete?
I don't know if we can really blame the internet for the broader turn away from the humanities or history, but I mean, I also miss, it feels like there was more in the 90s. We actually just rewatched some Wishbone, which Allison had never seen. Margaret, love that your eyes got big at that. I mean, Wishbone was so important to me, but I really think there's such a space for storytelling, which really at its core is what history is about. It's stories about how people understood their world and their place within it and what we can learn from that. And I think that there's such a place for kids to learn about history. It's just not happening. And it's because there, I think, is a broader turn that has devalued questions or stories about what it means to be human in favor of more STEM kind of focused programming. And I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it can be a both and, but I do think we're at a moment where I would love to see more popular kind of history aimed at kids, whether it's on TV or not. Maybe it's out there and I just don't know it. So I'm also putting that out there.
And to give the brand, credit where it's due, the character of Claudie Wells, does so much of what the brand used to do historically very well. I can't speak to the popularity of it among young people because I just don't know that. I know that adult collectors are absolutely fascinated. They're learning a ton about the Harlem Renaissance. I think, one of the most important phrases in your question is the tiny material culture, right? This idea that you can play with small things or things that are designed for you and learn about something. I'm not sure how much 10-year-old girls are using material culture to learn about the past, but I also know that objectively, like, we have the data, we have the life experience and talking to thousands of people that having meaningful play makes a difference long term. So I think we won't know until 20 years from now what are the things that young people are accessing. And maybe it's filmmaking, maybe it's making jokes and memes and cartoons about the past. But I think that physical element of interacting with something that makes you think about other people's lives, I do think that that is one of the most valuable legacies of American Girl.
I am going to do one more question, and then we're going to do the signature question that we talked about. So this one is from Lauren. Do you think that the change from the Pleasant Company to Mattel changed the value of the brand less from history to making money?
I think we put a pretty compelling argument in the book that that change is already underway and that starts to happen within the first 6 to 7 years of the brand, which is the early 90s. And that part of what makes this brand, this Pleasant Company, so interesting to Mattel is that they've already pivoted to lifestyle products. They've already started thinking about tweens as this huge market and that they are able to sell them everything from catalogs to like historic looking boots. I think that there is obviously a huge change that comes with the acquisition by Mattel. But if you really look at what the brand is doing in the 90s, the scale of the ambition, I think Pleasant actually hasn't gotten as much credit as maybe her company should have for that. They were already thinking well beyond, just a few historical products or 6 stories for a number of dolls. And so that's what made it attractive to Mattel. And then those changes that come after, I'm not sure that it's all just because of the brand change.
I think that's definitely true. I also do think that Mattel was less interested in telling historical stories. And even as Pleasant herself was broadening her scope from that original vision, I think it was of less importance to Mattel probably. So, I mean, it's interesting to consider that the person who named Barbie as her, the model she was creating this against, then willingly sells her product to Barbie. So it's hard to kind of sit with that, but I think Allison's right.
This has been such a fascinating conversation. And to everybody who typed in those great questions, thank you very much. Margaret, Mary, and Allison, it's such a pleasure. Such a pleasure to host you. And congratulations, Mary and Allison, on the publication of Dolls of Our Lives tomorrow.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Margaret. Thank you to everyone at Blue Willow who has made this event possible. And in the words of my roommates, thank you for being a friend.
We're going to end with one final question. At the bookstore, we often talk about books of your heart. So I would like all 3 of you to tell us a book of your heart, and Caroline will be very kindly pasting those in so everybody who's watching can see. And I will send a list of the books to everybody who bought a ticket so you don't have to worry if you miss it. So let's go. Margaret, Mary, Allison.
A book of my heart is Random Family by Adrienne Nicole LeBlanc. It's the best book I've ever read. It's also like the book that probably like changed my adult life the most of any book. One of my friends who recommended it to me said more happens on one page of this book than in like every other book you've ever read. And that's pretty much true, but it's just like, it's one of the greatest works of nonfiction that's ever been published. And I really, if you're ready to like get your mind blown, that has to be at the absolute top of the list.
Random Family is one of those books where I was like, oh my God, I really want to be a writer, but like, how do you get to this place? Like, it's so good. Yeah, I literally was like, oh my God. When I put that down, I was like, I don't know how this person did this. Like, I'm so glad that you said that, because I was just talking about that book with someone. It's one of my favorite all-time books. Highly recommend. I'm coming at you with a book of poetry, which is not what I thought I would be bringing to this had you asked me an hour ago, but it's on my mind. I love Mary Oliver. I want to recommend her book Felicity, which is about all kinds of love. So loves between friends, chosen family. A poem from this book was read at my wedding. It's very important to me. And if you've never had the gift of Mary Oliver in your life, even if you think poetry is not for you, it's really special and highly recommend.
I'll recommend a book that I read earlier this year that I really loved, which was called Hello, Beautiful. And it's kind of a modern retelling of Little Women. I always say that Little Women is my favorite story, but it's one of my least favorite books. I find it actually to be a really hard book to read, even though I love the story. And Hello, Beautiful is just an imaginative and modern retelling that is very emotional, very fascinating, and totally took me by surprise. So highly recommend that book.
That is one of my colleagues' favorite books of the year. She absolutely adores that. Y'all, thank you for being with us. We're so, so grateful for your time. To everybody who purchased a ticket, thank you so much, because by buying a ticket, you support the authors and you support our event programming. So we really appreciate that. Margaret, you were an incredible moderator. Thank you so much for all the work you do.
Thank you so much. And I really have to say thank you to Allison and Mary, because I was such a huge fan of the podcast. It just like really got to bring back that huge part of joy of my childhood into adulthood. And so glad that you're able to do that for so many of your listeners and readers.
Thank y'all for being here. I hope you have a great evening, everybody. Bye-bye.